Hey everyone, Eggman here with another video, and today we have the week 0 power rankings for the OP09 meta of the One Piece card game. This is through TCG Matchmaking, which I do appreciate them collecting this data and making it available, and if you guys want to support them, you can check out their Patreon, which is linked on the page or in the description, but this is their power rankings based on the rank ladder that they host. So these are also based off matches for, 100 million, or sorry, 1,000 million or more bounty, so not like the highest ranking, but something to kind of weed out some of the lower ranking games and try to standardize the data as well. So we're going to go over the power rankings, the matchup chart for this last week, as well as the top placing, or sorry, the top win percent version of each deck list that we're talking about as well. But if you guys want to support the channel, please make sure to hit that like and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. And you can find this page linked in the description, and this will be updated every week as well. But this is, again, week 0 because we are kind of on the cusp of OP09 coming out in North America. Obviously, we know all the cards, and a lot of people have been testing since we do have the Card Fest finals on January 4th and 5th. So this is just some ramp up, and the next week we'll have the proper week 1 of it as well. But we're going to jump on into it looking at the power rankings themselves. And so there has been a bit of an update for how this is calculated and how they rank it too. Win rate used to just be the bread and butter of the biggest thing, but they do now have a new formula, which I'm not going to go into the details of it in this video, but it is explained on their Patreon as well. But it's based on a calculation of the win rate, but also how many players played the deck and how consistent it was and that kind of thing. So it's based on more than that. So because there's sometimes where a deck has like a high win rate, but because like not a lot of people are on it and it's only like the good people are on it, and then sometimes win rates for decks are lower than average, mostly because more people are looking into it. For example, Shanks and Teach, I think, are the most popular leaders right now, on top of with Dofi as well. You can see it by the match number. A lot of people are on these three. I think these three are more than the other 7 combined. But because of that, that means there's not only good players, but also some mediocre players that can bring it down too. So I like this new system. I appreciate them finding better ways to represent the data and get these power rankings as accurate as possible. But for it, we do have Doflamingo in spot number 1. We have Rob Lucci in spot number 2. Then Shanks, Purple Luffy, and Marshall D. Teach to round out the top 5. And then the bottom 5 are Bonnie, Zoro, Katakuri, Star Deck 13 Luffy, and then Star Deck 10 Luffy. I am not going to look forward to how many different Luffys are in this meta, and half of them are Star Deck ones as well. But that aside, I do think this is a pretty good mix of leaders that are viable right now. All of these have positive win rates on the ladder too, which is really interesting to see, outside of the Star Deck 10 Luffy, which we'll talk about in a bit. But seeing a lot of these decks just do very strong, I think just kind of shows how good like this meta is. There's just a lot of viable decks, which are really cool to see. I am really happy to see how many different decks are viable, and the decks that are viable are in a good spot. So some decks that are kind of missing in my mind that will maybe rotate in with the meta for the rest of this. So maybe something to see on week 1. No Smoker, which I thought was really interesting. There's also the Black and Purple Luffy, which we haven't seen as much of. Those two in particular, I've been seeing a lot of people test and play. No copies of Enel, but we still have Bonnie in this one, and that's kind of really it, if I'm being honest. I've been testing a lot of maybe cusp of the meta decks, and so maybe not as much I've been testing would be on here. I think Star Deck 10 Luffy is pretty good. Despite its negative win rate, I do think are some really cool ways to play the deck, and it's probably one of the better metas for it in its existence too. So these are just the quick power rankings. And if we go up to the matchup chart, and also I do want to mention that this is just the snapshot for this past week. If you guys are a Patreon of the TCG matchmaking server, you will get access to the live chart of this, so you can find different parameters and look into this a little bit more. So it is a little bit more flexible if you are a Patreon member on that side. But looking at the top 10 deck list, we do see Shanks with a pretty high win rate as well, but also being a pretty standard win-loss against everything. Most of them are pretty even. I think the only deck that is causing it issues are a Purple Luffy of any sort. With the standard Purple Luffy are the red and purple one, making it a little bit tough for them to end games. And then maybe a little bit on the black and yellow Luffy. But deck's been pretty good. It's one that I've been having a lot of issues with personally, in the sense of I'm trying my best to figure out the best way to play it. But I know that there's a lot of people on it. There's going to be someone who cracks the consistency code that they really appreciate and like, and they're going to get that to be a little bit stronger. So I'm not sure what that looks like right now, but I think Shanks is in a good spot. We see Doflamingo's in a similar spot, having like pretty even matchups across the board. Only kind of tough matchups in this meta is pretty much Rob Lucci, right? Like Rob Lucci's the biggest one. Everything else is about evenish, and I personally think Doflamingo is the best deck in this format right now, and that kind of shows what this matchup chart looks like as well. Teach is in kind of a weird spot. It is a particular deck, which means that people need to learn how to play against it, but people also need to learn how to play as it, which is going to be big. But I do think it's going to be the deck in this format that has the biggest target on its back, because everyone is making sure that they can play around the fact that their on-play effects can be negated. So because of that, like Shanks is a little bit tough. Doflamingo's its worst matchup in the meta right now. Purple Luffy's not too far behind, but you do have some good matchups into Rob Lucci in particular. Also, any of the like the Star Deck 10 and the OP09 Luffy. Bonnie's a little bit in your favor. Looks like Pudding is somewhat popular right now, but you have a really good matchup against that because you can just turn off their 10 mobs, and then a Nell as well. Like you get a lot of value from yellow in the fact that a lot of their healing effects don't work out either. So I think that's very strong. And then a lot of people have been talking about like what's the best purple Luffy that's in this meta, and I think most people have decided the OP05 purple standard Luffy is the best one. Our only real bad matchup is Rob Lucci at times and Bonnie, which is a little bit tough because they can interact with your board, but we get so fast with our board climb. We've gotten so many better cards to use because of our leader effect, and it makes it really tough for some decks to stabilize against it. So I think that's still in a good spot. Rob Lucci, I think some people are underestimating this deck a little bit in the fact that it does have a bad matchup into the Teach inherently, and I think that's fine. But across the board outside, right, like we've got some really good matchups. The only other one is like the Shanks one, which is like a little bit not in our favor, but I think it's something that's super winnable too. We just have to be really cognizant of them like rushing down our board at times with the big bodies. So the fact that we are able to establish these, 8-drop, 9-drop, 10-drop cards that also have rush and get immediate value, make it a little bit harder for Rob Lucci to get it value from removing it. So I think that's something that's keen for that matchup and compared to everything else. But outside of Rob Lucci, and of course we still have like Black Yellow Luffy being the bane of their existence, but I don't think it's going to be as popular as it was in OP08, but it will still be present. But across the board, Lucci still has a lot of great matchups, and I think there are some ways to make this Teach matchup a little bit in our favor. Not positive, but closer to even as well. And then we've got our Red Purple Luffy, which again has a bit of a negative win rate, but it does have some good matchups against Shanks specifically. We have ways to like Teach is like a little bit not in our favor, and Dofi's tough because we are a 3-life leader. But Purple Luffy we can stabilize against, and as well as a couple other targets in this meta. It's a little bit tough to play this deck, and I know like it's if you have like no cards in hand with combo, you can get a lot, or sorry, with counter, you don't get a lot of leeway, right? The 3-life. It takes its effects really quickly, and you need to be as proactive and healthy as possible. But being a 6k leader does get you out of some attacks for free, which is really nice, and I do think that this deck is still good in a lot of ways too. So it's been fun testing and playing it. I think there's a lot of cards that you can take advantage with this one, and I think it's still going to be pretty present in this meta as well. And then we have Bonnie, and Bonnie's always been like a 50-50, like maybe like slightly negative deck. We still have our rough matchup with the Rob Lucci, but I think that's going to be a little bit less present. Our best matchup is the Black and Yellow Luffy, which unfortunately will also be a little bit less present, but we have an okay matchup into Purple Luffy. Shanks is a little bit tough for us. We're a little bit even into Dofi and Teach, and then we do also have like a positive win rate against like the other Luffys as well. But I think this is not a terrible choice. Bonnie's been generically the best green deck in the game. Pretty much since release, and that hasn't really been changing lately, but it just doesn't get a lot of support from this set and just kind of does the same thing as it has. So we'll see that in that over there. Black Yellow Luffy, I think a lot of people just abandoned this deck when Teach came out because it does counter this deck pretty hard. We do see we have like a 33% win rate against the deck, but I do in the same way think that you can make that matchup a little bit better if you play around it, which is nice. And you're not always going to find Teach. I think the first couple weeks it's going to be tough because Teach is probably going to be one of the most popular decks in events, but after that, I feel like more and more people are going to keep walking away from it and go back to something that they're a little bit more comfortable with. So I don't know if that's going to be true or not, but that's kind of my interpretation of this too. But other than that, we do have a lot of good matchups with the Luffy. So I think if you like the deck, you can stick to it and just try to figure out the Teach matchup in general. And then Zoro, I think that Zoro is just going to be in a good spot because it's early meta. generally speaking, I think aggro decks do better in the early parts of a meta because that people are still trying to figure out the best optimized version of their deck, and the best way to punish an unoptimized deck is to play aggro. So I think Zoro's like that, and I think Katakuri's like that. And we do have some pretty good numbers. Like, look at Zoro. The only like bad matchup for us is Rob Lucci, which is going to be less present. Everything else is positive or even, right? Purple Luffy's about even, which generally we win those matchups, so that's pretty interesting. And then Doflamingo is about even too, so that's impactful. And then we also have Katakuri. Katakuri is a little bit more dependent on their on play, so Cheech is a rough matchup for us. But the rest of the spread seems pretty easy outside of Doflamingo as well. So interesting to see these numbers, this data, and again, I appreciate TCG Matchmaking for providing it. So now we're going to go over to the top 10 deck list. So these are the ones that are the highest win rate on the ladder for each one of the leaders in the power rankings, and we're going to start off with our first one, which is the Don Quixote Doflamingo. This has not really changed much since OP08, or at least 8.5 with the release of the Star deck with the Doflamingo support. And I think the only thing that people have been doing a little bit more is confirming that they're playing the Jozu a little bit more. I think the 2-drop Teach as well has been just a more standard ad for this. I've been seeing it still in the OP08 meta, people either using it or not really consistently on one way or the other, but I think this deck is in a really good spot for this meta still. It's probably the best deck right now. It's really flexible. You get to be really aggressive early game, and you're able to make some wide boards, which is generally the worst thing for a deck like Teach, which is going to be very popular too, where they have to be at like a higher life total. They're really good at getting out of 1 or 2 attacks per turn, but once you get 3 or 4 attacks, that's where it gets a little bit tricky for the deck in my experience. So I think Doflamingo is still going to be very strong. There's going to be a lot of different like one-of changes of ratios for builds, but this is the one that's been doing the best on the ladder. And but don't think that this is the only way to build this deck either. So there's Doflamingo, and then next up we've got Rob Lucci. And I really like this build in particular. I think it's made some changes to adapt to what the new meta is going to be looking like in OP09. First thing is that we have 4 copies of the EBO1 Brook. The fact that this can attack later on and get rid of cards is really strong. Means you do get to play around Blackbeard pretty good, so that's strong. And because that is generally our worst matchup in the deck, in the field right now. And to continue to adapt to that, we also have a copy of Brook, which we do have to, if they negate our on plays, we can't play this. So that is sometimes stuck in our hand, but I do think it's good against like BY Luffy and some other decks that being able to circumvent protection, which is really nice. We also have 2 copies of Kaido, which I know this is like a tech option in OP08, but I do think this is a bit mandatory now in OP09. This does get rid of a 10-cost Teach with the add of like a Tempest Kick or an Ice Age. We can use an Activate main since it's not an on-play effect. And also, Teach generally likes to have every card in their hand, kind of like the BY matchup, where you're able to use the effect, and because you do that, they have to discard a card, which they would have used to be able to discard for their leader effect. It's just really like this card is like the best counter for, I think, not only BY, but also for the Teach. So in other matchups, it's a little bit slow. It can be stuck in our hand, but I think it's a good ad. It's kind of mandatory right now, and I think you should respect that. And then also the Finger Pistol. Again, this gets around on play, so if you need to get rid of a Teach, Ice Age and Finger Gun or Finger Pistol gets rid of it, and then you can just continue your turn, which is good and pretty good for this deck too. So I like these adjustments. I think that does make the Teach matchup a little bit stronger, and I think more decks will be leaning towards more of this build than what we've been seeing previously. So there's the Rob Lucci. Next up, we've got Shanks, and again, I've been really tough. I had a hard time figuring out the best way to play this deck, but I have been thinking about like maybe I've been playing too much of a top end, like what's their best way to kind of circumvent that, and I like this build that's been generated as well. So we are only running 20 cards without counter, and then 6 of them are these event cards. So this technically has counter if you really want to think about that. So 18 copies, and then this does if we leave Dawn open, which is not too terribly hard to do. So I think that's great. And then we have 4 copies of the Silver Israeli, which has been really great. We've got 4 copies of the Monkey G Dragon, which has been very great as well. And then the 10-cost Shanks. You really want to see this on curve as soon as you can every time. So 4 copies, I think, is the minimum you have to run, which means the maximum you should run is also 4. But if you end up finding and running the Uta Searcher, I think you can kind of circumvent it a little bit. But this is just, again, like it's a weird deck. Sometimes like you just brick up and you can't really do anything and you feel like you lose already. But sometimes you just feel like you have everything, you play it on curve, and your opponent really can't keep up. They're just always behind. So I don't know how I feel about this deck. It's going to do well. It's not going to be me piloting when it does do well, but it's going to be present in this meta, and you should definitely see what they can do and know how to play against this deck because it is a bit atypical at time with the leader once per turn effect. But I do like the implementation of the Red Hawk. I think most people are playing around it though, so you might want to bump this down to 2 or 3 copies. But also, if it's the last card in your life, it can legitimately win you the game. It's kind of like a Bayesian life, if you want to think of it that way, and that can be very, very strong in its own way. But I think this deck is good. I like to see Shanks doing well, and hopefully it will in the next couple weeks too. So there it is there. Purple Luffy. We've been, again, there's just so many different flavors of Purple Luffy, not only this leader, but many others as well, that there's going to be a lot of particular deck lists that I think pop up in the next little bit. So in this one, I do think that playing the Luffy Taro 7-drop makes sense. We do have a lot of different cards to take advantage of this as well. Additionally, like we do want to play this 4-drop Zoro as soon as we can, so that helps us as well as like Songoro is great too. And I don't know if this is just me, but I've been feeling like there's less removal in this early game than we used to have in OP08. I could play a 5-drop and even sometimes like a 4-drop, and it just survives because my opponent might not be playing some removal. So because of that, we get to make some stickier bodies on board for this deck, which you really pay off with. We are playing the new Sanji as well. This is super great. It's kind of like a rush card and a Uso Hachi built into one, so that helps us out a lot too. Charlotte Linlin, I like this on top of being able to heal us one, delay the game, and get us one deeper into the game. And then also the new 9-drop Secret Rare Luffy. This one I've been feeling like a little bit under represented for this one. It's fine. It is an on-play rush, so if you're playing against Teach, they can turn off the rush effect, which feels kind of bad. But there are some times where, like, it's a 10k rush, it draws us a card. I just feel like this only does well if we're already ahead and we can afford to just waste our turn on a 10-drop rush card, right? Which sometimes we can, usually we can, but sometimes I feel like it's just kind of stuck in my hand at times. So 3 seems like a little bit heavy, but I think that's fine. And then also the Gum Gum Giant. I don't think I have to explain this card. This has been the bane of a lot of people's existence. This is super good. Dawn -2 is not nearly as of a negative effect as I'm sure they thought it was. And the fact that if you're at 10 Dawn, this is just a better rad beam 100%. You can't go back to back without losing any Dawn, but it's so good. It's so good being able to fix our hand and also get out of an attack. It's just there's nothing bad about the card right now. So I think all that's very strong. I think this deck is in a really good spot. We also appreciate the the Trafalgar Law as a searcher for this. And it finds pretty much most of our deck, which is pretty crazy. So, but this is the build here, and this is what Purple Luffy's looking like. But I do think there's going to be a lot of different builds in the next couple weeks for this one as well. And then next up, you've got Teach. This is probably like the most cookie cutter version, like leader in the game right now, outside of maybe BY Luffy. And the fact that we are so dependent on doing the one thing that this deck is known for that we really can't stray that far from doing so. I've seen some people put like 7-drop. The 9-drop Kaido, the 7-drop King, or Sasaki, sorry, that you can use because they're activate mains and not on plays. But most people just kind of play something like this. We just want to play a lot of our cards. I think the only card outside of the archetype that we play a lot of is Laboon. I will say I have a lot of people saying like this is one of the most expensive cards in the game right now. If they don't have it, do they need to? I think you need to play at least 2 if you want to be at like a locals viable kind of level. If you're going to regional, you probably need to have 4 copies of it. But if you want to test out the game and you have like 2 copies of this, I'd recommend it just as a test for it. You can play it without it too. It does feel a little bit worse, and I won't deny that. But I do think that this is a unfortunately good card that is needed for the deck too. I do like the addition of Ice Age. I also have been playing the Tempest Kick because we do fill up our trash pretty quickly in comparison to a lot of other decks. So that sometimes is just a free draw and reduction, but sometimes the -3 isn't enough for what removal we need to be doing too. So it's up to you if you want to do that. But Finger Gun or Finger Pistol still very good. Black Hole still very good for this, and then our Stage and our Searcher. So deck's pretty straightforward. You know what it looks like, but here it is in case you haven't seen it quite yet. All right, next up is Bonnie, which is, again, just continuing being the best green deck in the game, which is, I think, a little bit of a low bar, but it does clear it. The fact that we do have our defensive properties, the fact that we do get to the late game and we get some punishing cards, I think is very strong. I kind of mentioned this in my tournament, but video that I made for my OP09 tournament I ran this week. But the Zoro was not super common, I think, in this deck at the end of OP08.5, and I've been seeing it come back into rotation a little bit more. Mostly because Rob Lucci is less present. There are some decks that really can't answer this when it's played, and then you kind of just put your opponent on a clock, which is really interesting. So the fact that less decks can consistently interact with this card means that I think it does deserve more of a spot in this meta right now. Same kind of thing with Basil being at 4 copies now. It used to be at 3 for the end of this. We're not playing Ooh Rouge, iconically, which I think was a staple when the deck first came out. But since there's so many different ways to interact with a 4-drop and you don't really get any value for it anymore, I think it's better just to use your draw cards and kind of wait until Cavendish hits the board, which is generally the better one as well. So we are also playing the Rosinante. I like this card. It being an on-play feels a little bit worse when you're playing against Teach in particular, but it's fine. It's something that you can also use to just, protect your green cards, which sometimes comes up in its own way. But I do think it's just fine. And then notably, we're not playing 8-drop Useless Kid, which I think was generally a staple for this deck in a lot of ways. But I do think that there are some decks that can interact with it a little bit more. The fact that we have like more cost reduction, or we can get rid of the kind of the smaller bodies at least a little bit easier, so we don't get to protect the 8-drop as much. I think that's something that impacts the ability of that card. But if you want to run the card, I will not stop you. I think it's still good. But it is, I think, interesting to see that it's not in the highest win rate version of Bonnie on the ladder right now, but that's what that looks like there. Next up, we've got Zoro. This is pretty self-explanatory. This is what I kind of mentioned, and Katakuri is kind of the same way. If you want to be really good at the beginning of any meta, just play the fastest aggro deck that you can, and I think Zoro kind of takes the crown for that. I know some people have been trying out Betty with some of the new aggro cards that it got to, and aggro being one of the best ways to just kind of beat down a Teach player. But this is tried, true, very consistent, and I'm not too surprised to see Zoro at these early stages being very strong on the ladder there. And also Katakuri, kind of similar story because it is based on a more aggressive strategy. You do kind of have a worse matchup into Teach, though, because you do appreciate having your 7-drop Linlin and your 10-drop Linlin, and half your cards are on plays, but you are still just a 7k aggressive leader that is able to get some advantage and push some damage too. We also are playing these 5-drop Katakuri since it is an activate main, so it does get around the Teach effect, which is strong. Turn up the top card of your live cards face up, give your leader up to one of your characters 1 rested Dawn. So the fact that you're a 5/6 blocker, the fact that you're able to give the Dawn out for free, especially if you're playing this on odd curve, this just means that you are putting a lot of pressure down. So it does make sense the add of this Katakuri back into this deck when it wasn't really in most decks in OPO 8.5. So there's the Katakuri build. Got 2 more. We've got the black and yellow Luffy, and this deck, we know what this looks like, right? There's no new tech options that have arrived, or people have been cycling in en masse, at least. I have been seeing some interesting ads of like Rygos at sometimes, or other removal cards, but we are a little bit, we really need the Gecko Moria in the deck, and if we were playing against Teach, we don't really get access to the Gecko Moria. But some ways to kind of circumvent that is that we do have like the 10-drop Kuzan, so giving the -5 to everything is very nice. The fact that we can pair this with a 10-drop or 5-drop Luffy means that we are able to like KO a 9 cost or less with that in conjunction, which is really good. Especially if we play out the Luffy first and then we play the Kuzan afterwards. It's an activate main, which is good. And our 5-drop Luffy is also an activate main, so we can get down to 1 or 0 life, at least some ways, since we can't use Flampe or Hiyori, which is kind of rough. Luckily, the 2-drop bodies are all activate mains, which means that we are able to become a 7 or 9k leader. The issue is that we don't get the recursion that we're used to in that way. So that means that we don't get to Gecko Moria them back against Teach, and we don't get to, like, if we even play Sabo, it's still a blocker, but we don't get the draw 2, trash 2, nor do we get the effect to like the KO protection either. So that's a bit of a bummer against that matchup, but I think people aren't respecting that this deck is still really viable against a lot of other decks, and that it's still going to be present, but definitely not at the caliber that it was, I think, from OPO7 and 8.5. But don't be surprised if this deck comes back around. I think people are going to pick it back up slowly, and it's still in an okay spot, just not like the tier 1, like maybe tier 0 status it was at the end of 8.5. So, but this is the build for Black Yellow Luffy, and to wrap it up, we do have the red and purple Luffy, which I really do like this deck. It's a lot of fun. It's really unique. every time someone looks at this deck, they kind of like, for the first time when they see the leader, they get questionable of like, how good is it actually? Like, it's 3 life, but it's a 6k. It gets to ramp, but it's a 3 life. You know what I mean? Like, it's a very interestingly designed deck that sometimes it feels broken, sometimes it feels like, anti-broken, and people just don't really have a good grasp of how good this deck is at any given time. So we do get to just take advantage of all the good like red and purple cards we've gotten in the last set or so. In particular, like the secret rare Shanks is also really good. Backbend's fantastic for like playing on curve and getting a removal, which is really nice. And then we still have access to like the 2 of the 10-drop Secret Rare Luffy, which this does play around some decks. And we, Red Purple Luffy really takes advantage of that card very quickly. If we're able to quickly just get to 10 Dawn, we can play it. We can slam it immediately if we don't have any board presence, and then we can just kind of loop back around pretty easy. So we use the effect at 0 Dawn, go to 1, Luffy effect to go to 2. From there, we go to our next turn, so we go to 4, Luffy effect to go to 5, and then at the start of next turn, we go to 7, Luffy effect to 8, and then the leader effect to go to 9. So we can really get our Dawn back very quickly. And one other card that I've been playing a lot of is the 7-drop Eustace Kid. I think this card is just really great right now, especially against Teach, where this does get a lot of great value. It's a little bit tricky for them to remove on board. And then if you're able to consistently make your leader a 6k leader, obviously a 7k leader with this one, a lot of decks really can't interact with you that easy, and you just get some free defense. So I feel like this card doesn't get touched against a lot of meta threats right now. It's very consistent on curve, and it usually get like 1 or 2 activations with this guy pretty consistently throughout a game, which I think is really impactful. So I've been enjoying playing it, and it's been very solid for my own testing too. So I highly recommend it. But other than that, I think this is a great deck. This has just been kind of a pile of cards that have been accumulating since release a year ago, and I think it's honestly in a good spot despite its win rate being a little bit negative right now. There's just a lot of things that this deck can really take advantage of. So this is the build here, and that's going to be it for this week of the power rankings. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you so much to TCG Matchmaking for providing this data. Make sure to check out their Patreon once again if you guys want access to more of it and to support them and everything else. So that's going to be it for me. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you all next time.